The town of San Jacinto was carved from red dust and stubbornness. It sat on a bend of the Guadalupe River, a waterway that could lie as placid as glass one week and boil with brown, churning fury the next. A single main street, rutted by wagon wheels and pocked by the hooves of 1,000 tired horses, connected the essential pillars of its existence: a saloon that was always loud, a church that was always quiet, a livery stable that smelled of honest work, and the ferry crossing managed by a man as old and weathered as the timber he guarded. This spring, the Guadalupe was in a foul mood. The water ran high and thick, the color of coffee with too little milk, and it slapped impatiently against the ferry pilings. Above, dark clouds bruised the sky over the distant hills, promising more rain that nobody needed. The air was heavy, carrying the scent of damp earth and the metallic tang of an approaching storm. Isabella Morales felt the weight of that sky as she arranged her small offerings at the weekly market. At 23, she was the widow of Miguel, a carpenter whose hands had been as kind as they were calloused. His death, a senseless accident involving a runaway horse a year past, had left a silence in her small house that felt bigger than the house itself. She survived on the skill of her own hands, with fine needlework that mended the town's clothes and loaves of bread that rose high and golden, perfumed with cinnamon and a hint of something uniquely hers. Her beauty was a quiet, undeniable fact. Like the heat of the Texas sun, it was in the dark, steady gaze of her eyes, the gentle curve of her mouth that rarely smiled but was all the more arresting when it did, and the fall of black hair she kept neatly bound at the nape of her neck. To the men of San Jacinto, this beauty was a thing to be admired in sidelong glances. To their wives, it was a provocation. They whispered that she had a way about her, a pull that unsettled good Christian men. They never said the word enchanting, but it hung in the air between their tight-lipped pronouncements. Watching the market from the shaded boardwalk in front of his office was Sheriff Eli Whitlock. Nearing 40, he was a man forged in the crucible of the war, a past he never spoke of but which was etched in the lines around his eyes and the permanent set of his jaw. He was known throughout the lower territories as Whitlock the Quiet. He was a legendary marksman who had not drawn his gun in anger in the 5 years he had been sheriff of San Jacinto. He spoke only when necessary, in a low voice that carried more authority than a shout ever could. And he held a deep, abiding contempt for mobs of any kind. Justice, to Eli, was a calm, deliberate thing, built on evidence and law, not on the fevered emotions of a crowd. He saw it all. He saw young Toby, the mail boy whose legs were too long for his body, dodge a pack of dogs with a grin. He saw Hank, the ferryman, spit a stream of tobacco juice and glare at the rising river as if it had personally offended him. He saw Dr. Finch making his rounds, his black bag a familiar sight. And he saw the town's moral compasses, Martha Caldwell and her flock, gathered near the general store. Martha, the mayor's wife, was a woman whose piety was as starched and unbending as her collars. With her were Agnes Turner, Ruth Hemlock, and Evelyn Pritchard, women of standing whose whispers could build a reputation or tear one down before lunchtime. Their eyes followed Isabella Morales with a particular intensity, their conversation a low, continuous murmur, like the buzzing of angry wasps. The market hummed with a nervous energy. The threat of rain and the reality of dwindling supplies had put everyone on edge. A blight had damaged the winter wheat, and the last shipment of flour had been delayed by a washed-out railway bridge upriver. People bartered with a harder edge, their faces pinched with worry. Isabella sold her last loaf of bread to a young farmer and was packing her basket when the sky finally broke. It was not a gentle rain. It was a sudden, violent deluge, a gray sheet of water that turned the dusty street into a slick of red mud in seconds. The air exploded with the sound of the downpour, drumming on canvas awnings and wooden roofs. People scrambled for cover, shouting and laughing as they ran, their market day cut short. Isabella pulled the hood of her simple blue cloak over her head and made her way through the chaos. her head down against the driving rain. She passed the mayor's office, where the town's tax box, a heavy iron coffer, sat on a wooden cart, waiting to be loaded for its trip to the county seat. In the confusion of the storm, 2 deputies were struggling to cover the cart with a stiff oilcloth. Isabella barely noticed it as she hurried toward her small home at the edge of town. An hour later, the rain had softened to a persistent drizzle, and the mayor himself, flustered and red-faced, burst into Sheriff Whitlock's office. The tax box was gone. In the ensuing panic, it had vanished from the cart. There were no tracks in the sea of mud, no witnesses who had seen anything but the pouring rain. The town's entire tax collection, money for the new schoolhouse and the doctor's salary, had disappeared as if swallowed by the storm itself. Sheriff Whitlock listened, his face impassive. He took his hat, settled it on his head, and walked out into the mud. He stood where the cart had been, his gaze sweeping the area, missing nothing. The crowd that had gathered kept a respectful distance. They knew better than to offer theories to Whitlock the Quiet. He dealt in what he could see, what he could prove. But Martha Caldwell and her friends dealt in something else entirely. They had taken shelter under the awning of the dressmaker's shop, and their whispers had already begun to weave a new reality. "I saw her," Agnes Turner said, her voice sharp. "Isabella Morales. She walked right past the cart, just as the sky opened up." "Her cloak," Evelyn added, her eyes wide. "It was that blue one. It was soaked through, dripping. She looked strange." Martha Caldwell listened, her lips pursed. She was a master of insinuation. Odd, wasn't it? How the storm came so suddenly, a perfect distraction. She let the word hang in the air. Some might say it was called a storm to hide a theft. The seed was planted. It was a poisonous, impossible seed, but in the fertile ground of San Jacinto's fear and suspicion, it found purchase. The town was poor, hungry, and now it had been robbed. They needed someone to blame. The story traveled from the dressmaker's shop to the saloon, passed from husband to wife over supper tables. It grew with each telling. She walked by, and the rain began. She wore a wet cloak, like a river spirit. She bewitches men, does she not? Perhaps she can bewitch the very sky. By morning, the whisper had become a theory. By noon, it was treated as fact. Isabella Morales, the quiet widow, the woman whose beauty was a sin in the eyes of many, had used some dark power to summon a storm and steal the town's money. The word they used, at first in hushed tones and then with righteous fury, was witch. Isabella knew nothing of it until she went to the general store for thread. The moment she stepped inside, the conversation stopped. Eyes turned to her, cold and accusing. The storekeeper, who had always been kind, suddenly could not meet her gaze and claimed he was fresh out of the color she needed. As she left, the silence broken only by the sharp click of the closing door. She felt the weight of their judgment like a physical blow. She walked home, her heart a cold knot in her chest. The river had risen even higher overnight, its brown water licking at the banks. A section of the small wooden bridge that crossed a tributary had washed away, severing a key route out of town. The world felt like it was closing in, the water rising on one side, a wall of hatred rising on the other. In her small, quiet house, she looked at the portrait of Miguel that sat on the mantel. He had been so full of life, so solid. She had always felt safe with him. Now, she was utterly alone. A wave of the old guilt washed over her. Why him and not her? Why was she the one left behind to face this? The sorrow was a familiar ache, but this new fear was a sharp, jagged thing. The accusation was absurd, a fever dream, but she saw the conviction in their eyes. In a town like San Jacinto, conviction was more dangerous than truth. Later that day, Sheriff Whitlock stood by the angry river, watching Hank and a few other men work to secure the ferry landing. The loss of the bridge made the ferry the only way across. He had spent the morning searching for any sign, any clue to the whereabouts of the tax box, and had found nothing. But he had heard the talk. It was impossible not to. The word witch was now being spoken openly on the street. He looked back toward the town, his expression unreadable. He saw the church steeple, the saloon doors swinging open and shut, and the small houses where fear and suspicion were simmering like a stew over a low fire. He was a man of the law. The law required evidence, a witness, a confession. The town was offering up a ghost story, but he knew how quickly a ghost story could lead to a rope. His duty was clear, if not simple. He had to find the money, and he had to protect the rule of law from the rising tide of rumor, a tide that was proving to be every bit as dangerous as the flooding Guadalupe. The quietest sheriff in Texas was about to be pitted against the loudest mob, and the life of a lonely woman hung in the balance. The chill of San Jacinto's suspicion was a different kind of cold than the river wind. It seeped through walls and settled in the bones. Isabella felt it first at the baker's, a place where she had once traded her own loaves for pastries. The baker's wife, a woman whose children had worn clothes Isabella mended, folded her arms and said the ovens were cold. Isabella could smell the lie, warm and yeasty, from the street. Next, it was the lumber yard. She needed a small plank to repair her porch step, a simple piece of wood Miguel would have cut for her in minutes. The proprietor, a man who had praised Miguel's skill at his funeral, quoted her a price that was double the usual. He stared at a point just over her shoulder as he spoke, his face a mask of uneasy greed. She paid it without a word, her dignity a currency she refused to devalue. But the weight of the coins leaving her palm felt like a surrender. The deepest cut came on Sunday. Dressed in her best black dress, she walked to the church, seeking the solace of its familiar silence. But as she approached the steps, she saw Father Donovan hesitate. Before he could speak, Martha Caldwell and her circle stepped forward, forming a silent, unmovable wall in front of the heavy oak doors. They did not touch her. They did not speak. They simply stood, their face set in pious judgment, barring her entry into the house of God. Isabella stopped, the gazes of the entire congregation burning into her back. She held their stare for a long moment, her chin high, before turning and walking away, the sound of the closing church doors as final as a gavel. She began to take her walks at night, when the town was asleep and the accusing eyes were shuttered. The moon was a sliver in the sky, offering little light. The only constant sound was the roar of the Guadalupe, a hungry, guttural noise that grew louder with each passing day. It was on one of these nights, as she stood on the muddy bank, feeling the spray on her face, that they found her. Martha Caldwell was not alone. With her were Agnes, Ruth, and Dorothy Pritchard, their dark cloaks making them look like specters in the gloom. They emerged from the shadows near the ferry landing, their steps silent in the soft earth. "Walking in the dark, Mrs." Morales Martha's voice was smooth, yet it carried an edge that cut through the river's noise. "Looking for something you lost, or perhaps calling something to you." Isabella's heart hammered against her ribs, but she did not retreat. "I am doing no harm to anyone, Mrs. Caldwell." "Harm is a matter of perspective." Agnes sneered. "The town's treasury is gone. Our supplies are low. Men look at you with thoughts they shouldn't have. That sounds like harm to us." They moved closer, slowly surrounding her, pinning her between their righteous circle and the treacherous, churning water. The riverbank, already slick with rain and spray, was crumbling in places. A small piece of earth gave way near Isabella's foot, tumbling into the brown foam below. "They say water is drawn to its own kind," Martha continued, her voice dropping to a conspiratorial whisper. "The river is angry. Perhaps it wants what was stolen from it. Perhaps it wants the one who called the storm that gave cover to a thief." They were words, only words, but they pressed in on her, heavy and suffocating. She took a step back, seeking solid ground, but her heel found only soft, wet mud. She flailed for balance, her arms pinwheeling in the dark. For a heart-stopping second, she teetered on the precipice, the hungry sound of the river filling her ears, promising a cold, violent embrace. Then, a rope snaked through the air, landing with a soft thud at her feet. It was attached to something, someone, standing in the deeper shadows beyond the women. A figure stepped forward, and the faint moonlight caught the silver of a star pinned to a heavy wool coat. Sheriff Eli Whitlock. He had not made a sound. The women turned, startled, their circle broken. Eli's gaze was not on them. It was fixed on Isabella. He gave the rope a slight tug, a silent command, her hands numb with cold and fear. Fumbled for a moment before she grasped it. He pulled, his strength steady and sure, drawing her away from the crumbling edge and onto safer ground. He walked past the silent cluster of women as if they were nothing more than fence posts. He stopped in front of Isabella, who was trembling, mud clinging to her dress. He didn't say a word. He simply unfastened his heavy coat, the fabric dark and smelling of the cold night, and draped it over her shoulders. The warmth of it was immediate, a shield against the wind and the venomous stares. He then turned and looked at Martha and her companions, his face still in shadow. He let the silence stretch, a weapon he wielded with more skill than any pistol. Finally, he spoke, his voice low and devoid of emotion. "Go home." It was not a request. They scattered without another word, melting back into the darkness. Eli watched them go before turning his attention back to Isabella. He gestured with his head toward the lights of the town. "I will see you to your door." He walked beside her, the silence between them thick but no longer menacing. When they reached her small house, she turned to hand him his coat. "Keep it," he said, his voice rough. "The night is cold." He tipped his hat and was gone, his footsteps fading into the sound of the river. The next morning, the town awoke to a new addition. Nailed squarely to the post outside the sheriff's office was a fresh sheet of paper, the black ink stark and official, in Eli Whitlock's precise, clear hand. It read, "Any person found to be spreading malicious and unsubstantiated rumors will be fined for disturbing the peace. The law deals in facts." Mayor Caldwell found the sheriff by the ferry crossing, watching Hank reinforce the moorings. The mayor was a man who preferred consensus to conflict, and his face was a portrait of agitation. "Sheriff," he began, gesturing vaguely at the notice, "this is unusual. It has people talking." "That's the point," Eli said, not taking his eyes off the river. The roar of the water was a constant assault. It reminded him of another river, long ago, during the war. It reminded him of the shouts of men as a pontoon bridge collapsed, the churning water swallowing them whole. He unconsciously touched a thin, white scar that ran from his temple into his hairline, a souvenir from the piece of shrapnel that had knocked him clear of the disaster that claimed his comrades. He hated the sound of loud water. "Well, yes, but the people are upset about the theft." The mayor blustered. "They feel this woman, that she is somehow involved. A town needs to feel secure. Eli, the law, in a way, is the will of the people." Eli finally turned to look at the mayor. His eyes were the color of a winter sky, and they held no warmth. "The law is the law, Mr. Mayor. It is not a weather vane to be turned by every gust of gossip. I am looking for a thief, not a witch." His gaze was steady, unwavering, and the mayor found he could not hold it. He mumbled something about needing to check on the town ledgers and made a hasty retreat. Isabella, meanwhile, was not idle. The warmth of Eli's coat had faded, but the memory of its solid weight had not. It was a reminder that she was not entirely alone, but it was not enough. She would not rely on a silent sheriff to appear in the dark. She needed her own strength. She found Hank at the ferry, coiling a thick rope. He was a man of few words, which was perhaps why she felt she could approach him. "Hank," she said, her voice clear and firm, "my husband had a flintlock rifle. It was his father's. I do not know how to use it." Hank stopped his work and looked at her, his expression grim. He had seen the way the town was turning on her. He spat a stream of tobacco. "A rifle ain't a needle and thread, ma'am." "I am aware," Isabella replied, her voice unwavering. "But a needle and thread will not protect me if that mob decides to do more than whisper. Will you teach me?" He studied her for a long moment. Seeing the steel in her eyes that had replaced the sorrow, he saw the proud set of her shoulders, the way she stood her ground. He gave a slow, deliberate nod. "Be at the Cottonwood Grove south of town at dawn, and do not be late." As she walked away, Isabella felt a flicker of something she had not felt in a long time. It was not hope, not yet. It was resolve. The town had labeled her and tried to isolate her. A silent man had offered a shield, but she was now forging her own sword. Sheriff Eli Whitlock's investigation had run aground in a sea of mud and speculation. For 2 days, he had methodically picked apart the scene of the crime, but the torrential rain had washed away any discernible tracks, leaving him with nothing but the town's ugly mood. He sat in his office, the door open to the street, listening to the rhythm of San Jacinto. It was a rhythm of fear. Every conversation seemed to circle back to Isabella Morales, the stolen money, and the unnatural storm. The word witch was no longer a whisper. It was a diagnosis. The break in the case came not with a clue, but with a mistake. Young Toby, the mailboy, burst into the office, his face flushed with panic, a canvas mail bag clutched in his hand. "Sheriff, I think I made a terrible error," he stammered, his voice cracking. He explained that in his haste during the storm, he had dropped his bag near the mercantile. He had gathered everything up, but a small, folded receipt must have slipped into the wrong delivery pouch. He had just found it wedged in the bottom of the bag meant for the county clerk. He held out the paper with a trembling hand, as if it were a venomous snake. Eli took it. It was a bill of sale from the freight office, dated the day before the storm. The items listed were peculiar for a town on the brink of a food shortage: 10 sticks of blasting powder and a 5-gallon drum of tar oil. The name on the receipt was George Turner. Eli folded the paper and slipped it into his vest pocket. He knew George Turner. He was Agnes Turner's husband, a man who wore starched collars even when fixing his own fence, a man desperate to maintain the appearance of prosperity. Eli also knew from the saloon keeper's idle gossip that George's credit was stretched thinner than a banjo string. He didn't have to connect the dots. They arranged themselves into a straight, ugly line, but motive was not proof. Blasting powder and tar oil were not a box of stolen money. He filed the information away, a single hard fact in a storm of fantasy. That night, a new terror seized San Jacinto. The frantic ringing of the church bells shattered the midnight quiet. A cry went up, hoarse and panicked fire. Eli was dressed and out the door in seconds. A hellish orange glow pulsed against the low-hanging clouds, lighting the town in a flickering, demonic light. The source was the town's granary, the large wooden storehouse that held what little flour and grain they had left. The whole town seemed to be running toward it, some with buckets, most with nothing but a morbid curiosity. The dry timber of the old building was catching fast, flames licking up the walls and devouring the roof. Amid the shouts and the crackle of the blaze, a new chant began. Rising above the chaos, it was Martha Caldwell's voice, shrill and certain. It is her work. First she calls the water to hide her theft. Now she calls the fire to starve us. The cry was taken up by others, a chorus of accusation. The witch, she means to ruin us all. While the bucket brigade fought a losing battle against the inferno, Eli ignored the hysteria. He circled the perimeter of the granary, his eyes scanning the ground in the dancing firelight. The crowd was focused on the front, on the spectacle of the flames. Eli moved toward the back, near the dark line of the trees. There, tucked away in the shadows, he found what he was looking for. It was a small bundle of rags, still smoldering, reeking of tar oil. A few feet away, in a patch of soft earth, was a single, clear boot print. It was a man's boot, worn at the heel, but there was something odd about it. The print was facing away from the granary, as if the person had been walking calmly into the woods. Eli knelt, studying it closely. He had seen this trick before, in the war. A man walking backwards in his own tracks to confuse anyone who might follow. It was the work of a man who was careful, a man who was hiding something. It was not the work of a phantom. He stood up, his face grim. The truth, he thought, was walking in the opposite direction from the crowd. The fire eventually burned itself out, leaving the granary a blackened, smoking skeleton. The loss of the food sent a fresh wave of despair and fury through the town. The accusations against Isabella grew louder, more certain. Now, they were not just whispers of witchcraft. They were calls for justice, the rough, immediate justice of the frontier. In the small hours of the morning, long after the last of the embers had died, a cloaked figure moved through the darkened streets. Father Donovan, his heart heavy with a mixture of fear and shame, approached Isabella's house. He had stood by silently at the church, had offered no words of comfort or defense as his flock turned on one of their own. He was a man of God, but he was also a man who feared the anger of the powerful, and Martha Caldwell's power in San Jacinto was absolute. He could not speak out, not yet, but he could not do nothing. He placed a small, cloth-wrapped bundle on her doorstep. It was a loaf of bread, still warm from the rectory's oven. A small, secret act of humanity in a town that seemed to have lost its own. He knocked softly, once, then melted back into the shadows before the door could open. The next day, Eli found Hank at the ferry landing, methodically checking the thick ropes that held the ferry against the river's relentless pull. The water had receded slightly, but it was still a brown, angry torrent. Hank nodded a greeting. "Heard you found something at the fire." "A boot print," Eli said, his gaze on the churning water. "Man's or devil's?" Hank asked, a dry smile touching his lips. "Man's. A man trying to look like he was going the other way." Hank grunted, giving a final, sharp tug on a rope. "Sounds like this whole town. You talk 3 words a day. Sheriff, it's almost too much noise for this place." Eli was silent for a long moment, the roar of the river filling the space between them. He thought of the receipt in his pocket, of George Turner's debts, of the backward boot print. He thought of Isabella Morales, trapped in her house, a prisoner of their fear. He looked at Hank, his expression unchanged, but for a flicker of something in his cold eyes. "4," Eli said. The sky, which had been threatening for days, finally made good on its promise with a vicious, targeted assault. It was not a widespread storm like the one that had served as cover for the thief, but a sudden, violent cloudburst that settled directly over the hills feeding the Guadalupe's tributaries. The result was a flash flood, a roaring beast of brown water and debris that came down the narrow creek beds and slammed into the main river with the force of a battering ram. The first warning was not a sight but a sound, a low groan from the earth that quickly swelled into a deafening wall of sound. Eli Whitlock was at the ferry landing, conferring with Hank about the strain on the moorings. When they both heard it, they shared a look of grim understanding, their years on the frontier having taught them to read the land's violent language. "It is coming down from the North Fork," Hank yelled over the rising din, pointing to where a smaller creek fed into the Guadalupe. "Miller's ranch is right in its path." Before the words were fully out of his mouth, they saw it a surge of water, 10 feet higher than the already swollen river, carrying whole trees and pieces of fence like toothpicks. On the far side of the creek, a small herd of Miller's cattle was trapped on a rapidly shrinking island of high ground. their panicked bellows barely audible over the flood's roar. Eli did not hesitate. He grabbed a coil of heavy rope from the ferry post. We need to get a line across to them before that patch of ground gives way. As if summoned by the crisis, Isabella appeared. She had been on her way to check the snares she had set for rabbits, her only reliable source of meat now that the town had turned its back on her. She saw the trapped animals, saw Eli and Hank preparing to act, and she ran to them, her skirts hitched up to free her legs. "I can help," she said, her voice steady and clear despite the chaos. Hank gave her a doubtful look, but Eli just handed her another coil of rope. "We will try to throw a line across. If we can secure it, we can guide them to the higher bank." The work was brutal and unforgiving. The sucking mud pulled at their boots, and the icy shock of the floodwater stole their breath. Eli, with his steady strength, threw the weighted rope again and again, trying to get it to catch on a sturdy sycamore on the other side. Hank, using a long pole, fought to keep their small skiff from being smashed against the pilings. It was Isabella who saw the solution. The main rope was too heavy, its arc falling short. She pointed to a smaller, lighter line. "Tie that one to the main rope," she instructed, her voice taking on a natural authority. "The throw will be easier, and we can use it to pull the heavier one across." It was a simple, practical idea, and it worked. On the next throw, the lighter line sailed across the churning water and snagged in the branches of the sycamore. Then came the hard part, pulling the heavy, waterlogged rescue rope through the current. All three of them put their backs into it, their muscles straining, their boots sliding in the slick mud. Once the line was secure, the real danger began. Eli waded into the treacherous water, the rope a lifeline in his hand, making his way toward the terrified animals. Isabella and Hank stayed on the bank, playing out the line, their hands raw and burning from the friction. As Eli reached the cattle and began guiding the first one into the water, Isabella's role became crucial. She worked a secondary rope, keeping the animals' heads above water, her movements efficient and sure. She tied off lines with quick, expert knots that held fast against the river's fury. Miguel had taught her the sailor's knots he used in his carpentry, for rigging and securing heavy timbers. His hands, strong and calloused, guiding hers on a summer afternoon that felt a lifetime ago. The memory was not painful now. It was useful. It was a piece of him that was still alive, still strong enough to hold against a flood. It took over an hour of burning lungs and aching backs, but they saved all but two of the animals. They worked in a rhythm born of necessity, a silent team forged in the heart of the flood. When the last steer was safe on high ground, they collapsed on the muddy bank, exhausted, soaked to the bone, and breathing in ragged gasps. The rain, as if its work was done, softened to a steady, persistent drizzle. "We need to get out of this wet," Hank grumbled, pushing himself to his feet. "There is an old hay barn up the rise. It should be dry enough." The barn was a small, dilapidated structure, but its roof was mostly intact, and the loft was filled with the sweet, dusty scent of old hay. It was a sanctuary from the wind and the rain. They built a small, smoky fire in a clearing on the dirt floor, and the warmth slowly began to seep back into their frozen limbs. Isabella, practical as always, produced a small tin of coffee and a pot from her satchel. She set it to boil on the fire, and the rich, bitter aroma soon filled the small space. She poured the steaming liquid into 3 tin cups. Hank took a sip, and his eyes widened in surprise. He took another, longer drink, then let out a low whistle. "Ma'am," he said, his voice full of a newfound respect. "A dead man could get up and plow a field after a cup of that. I reckon I will not be sleeping for 3 days." A small, genuine smile touched Isabella's lips. Then she looked over at Eli and saw that he was smiling too. It was a small, quiet thing, a slight upward turn of his mouth, but on his stern, unreadable face, it was as startling as a sunrise. It changed him, softening the hard lines etched by war and time. They sat in a comfortable silence for a while. The only sounds, the gentle drumming of rain on the roof and the crackle of the fire. The shared danger and hard labor had stripped away the town's artificial barriers, leaving only 3 people in a dry barn, grateful to be warm and alive. It was Isabella who broke the silence. She had been watching Eli, who was staring into the fire, but his gaze seemed to be 1,000 miles away. He still looked unsettled by the river's roar, which they could hear even from the barn. "The sound of the water," she said softly. "It troubles you." It was not a question. Hank, sensing a private moment, discreetly moved to the far side of the barn to check on a loose shutter. Eli did not answer immediately. He picked up a stick and poked at the fire, sending a shower of sparks into the air. When he finally spoke, his voice was lower and rougher than usual. "During the war," he began, his eyes still fixed on the flames, "my company had to cross a river at night, a pontoon bridge. The enemy got the range, and a shell hit the far side. The whole thing, it just came apart. The splintering of wood, the screaming of men and horses. The water was black and cold. Most of them could not swim, weighed down by their gear." He paused, and the old pain was raw in his voice. "I was lucky. A piece of shrapnel knocked me clear. I held onto a piece of the bridge. I watched the rest of them. I watched them go down." He fell silent, but the story hung in the air, a ghost of unimaginable loss. He unconsciously touched the scar at his temple. "I learned then that a man can be a good shot, a good tracker, and it means nothing when the whole world decides to wash away beneath your feet." Isabella looked at him, at this quiet, solitary man who carried the weight of a drowned company on his shoulders. She saw not just the famous sheriff, but the soldier who had survived when his friends had not. Her heart ached with a sudden, overwhelming empathy. Without thinking, she reached out and gently laid her hand on his arm, her fingers resting just below the faint white line of his scar. His muscles tensed at her touch, but he did not pull away. "You do not have to save the whole world, Sheriff," she said, her voice barely a whisper, but it carried in the quiet of the barn. "You just have to be there at the right time." He finally turned to look at her. In the flickering firelight, she saw an emotion in his eyes she could not name, a deep, vulnerable thing that he had kept hidden from the world. He was a man who had been saved from a river of death only to find himself stranded on an island of silence. And for the first time, someone had seen him there. The moment stretched, charged, and intimate. The distance between them had vanished, replaced by a shared understanding of pain and survival. For Isabella, looking at this man, she felt a warmth that had nothing to do with the fire. It was a dangerous feeling, a flicker of life in a part of her heart she thought had died with Miguel. The thought brought with it a faint, ghostly betrayal, and she slowly drew her hand back. For Eli, her touch and her words were like a key turning in a lock he had forgotten existed. He was a man of action, of deeds. Words, to him, were flimsy things, easily broken. He kept his own counsel because he was afraid of the promise that words make, a promise he might not be able to keep. But her words had not been a promise. They had been an absolution. He did not know how to respond, so he fell back into his old habit of silence. But it was a different kind of silence now. It was no longer a wall, but a shared space. As the rain finally subsided and a pale, watery light began to filter through the cracks in the barn walls, something had irrevocably shifted between the quiet sheriff and the woman the town called a witch. They had weathered the flood together and had found, in the wreckage, the beginning of a bridge. The harvest dedication was meant to be a day of reprieve, a collective prayer of thanks for what little the harsh land had given them. Long trestle tables were set up in the town square, laden with pies and preserves. A brave display of abundance in a season of scarcity. But the festive air was thin and brittle, stretched taut over a current of simmering resentment. A quiet word, a sidelong glance, could shatter the illusion of peace. Isabella arrived not as a participant, but as a statement. She would not be hidden away. She would not let their whispers confine her to the four walls of her home. She carried a basket with a single, perfectly baked loaf of bread, her contribution to the communal tables, an offering of peace she knew would likely be rejected. She walked with a newfound straightness in her back, a result of her dawn lessons with Hank and the heavy kick of the old flintlock against her shoulder. She was no longer just the widow Morales. She was a woman who knew how to load and fire a weapon. She had just placed the loaf on the edge of a table when the fragile piece broke. It was Martha Caldwell, of course, who cast the first stone. She stepped into the center of the square, her hands clasped as if in prayer, her face a mask of sorrowful duty. Agnes and Ruth flanked her like acolytes. "My friends, my neighbors," Martha began, her voice carrying across the square, silencing the nervous chatter. "We gather today to give thanks, but how can we be thankful when a shadow hangs over our town? We have been robbed. We have been burned. The river itself has risen against us. We are a good, God-fearing community. Yet we suffer." She paused, letting her words sink in, her gaze sweeping the crowd before landing, with pinpoint accuracy, on Isabella. "And the shadow has a name," she declared, her voice rising with theatrical fervor. "It has been here among us, with its quiet ways and its unsettling beauty. It walked by our tax box, and a storm appeared from a clear sky. The granary, which held the bread for our children, burned to the ground. She works with the river as if it were her own familiar spirit. I say we can have no peace, no prosperity, until this blight is removed from our midst." A low murmur rippled through the crowd, a sound like dry leaves skittering before a storm. The men, who had previously admired Isabella from a distance, now looked at her with a mixture of fear and anger. The women, emboldened by Martha's righteousness, took a step forward. "She must go!" someone shouted from the back. The cry was taken up by others. "Drive her out, let the county deal with her." The crowd began to close in, a slow, menacing tide of faces hardened by hardship and ignorance. They were no longer individuals, no longer the baker, the blacksmith, the farmer. They were a single entity, a murmuring beast looking for a sacrifice. Isabella stood her ground, her basket clutched in her hands, her heart a cold, tight drum against her ribs. She would not run. Then, a figure detached himself from the shadows of the boardwalk in front of the sheriff's office. Eli Whitlock moved with a deliberate, unhurried pace, yet the crowd parted before him as if he were a ship's prow cutting through water. He did not look at the angry faces. His gaze was fixed on Isabella. He walked through the human sea until he stood between her and the mob, his back to her, facing them. He did not draw his weapon. He did not raise his voice. He simply stood there, a silent, unmovable wall of law. He let the silence hang for a long, uncomfortable moment, his presence alone a rebuke. Then he mounted the wooden steps of the church porch, turning to face them all. For the first time since anyone could remember, he was going to make a speech. His voice, when it came, was not loud, but it was as clear and penetrating as a winter wind, and it carried to every corner of the square. "You have put this woman on trial," he began, his eyes sweeping over them, missing nothing. "You have put her on trial without a judge, without a jury, without a single piece of evidence that would stand in any court in this land. You have let fear and gossip be your law." He paused, letting them feel the weight of his condemnation. "The town labeled her a witch," he continued, his voice dropping slightly, "drawing them in. And I, the quietest man you know, I call her my miracle." A collective gasp went through the crowd. The sheer, stunning intimacy of the word, coming from this man, was like a physical shock. "Miracle of mine," he repeated, his gaze finding Isabella's over the heads of the stunned townspeople. Because when a man has seen enough of what men do to each other, he can fall into a blood-soaked silence. She pulled me from that silence to remember that justice is for the living, not for the ghosts of what we fear. The square was utterly still. No one moved. No one spoke. The accusation had been met with a testament so personal, so unexpected, that it had short-circuited their collective rage into that profound silence. A new sound broke the clear, resonant tolling of the church bell. Father Donovan, standing in the church doorway, his face pale but resolute, was pulling the rope. The sound washing over the square, a call to order, a dismissal of their profane court. The crowd began to shuffle, to look away from each other, the righteous certainty draining from their faces, replaced by an uneasy shame. Eli let the bell ring 3 times before he held up a hand. "Your fear is not entirely misplaced," he said, his voice returning to its normal, factual tone. "But it has been pointed at the wrong target. I have been investigating the fire and the theft. I have reason to believe we have a real threat in our midst. A man named Silas Pike, a gunman with a reputation for violence, has been seen in the territory. He and his men are not interested in witchcraft. They are interested in the gold payroll for the new railway line, which is scheduled to come across the ferry tonight." He let that news settle. He had given their fear a new face, a real one. Pike and his crew would like nothing more than a town distracted, a town chasing shadows and turning on itself. It would make his work that much easier. "So now you have a choice. You can continue this foolishness, or you can stand with the law and help me protect this town and that payroll." The spell was broken. The mob dissolved back into frightened individuals. They looked at each other, then at the sheriff, and then began to disperse, talking in low, urgent tones about Silas Pike, the phantom of the witch already fading from their minds. That evening, as a bruised twilight settled over San Jacinto, Isabella found Eli in the livery stable. The air was thick with the scent of dry hay, leather, and the warm, living breath of horses. He was checking the cinch on his saddle, his movements economical and precise. He did not seem surprised to see her. She stood for a moment in the doorway, the lamplight tracing her silhouette. He finished with the saddle and turned to face her. The space between them was filled with everything that had been said in the square, and everything that had not. "You are so quiet," she said, her voice soft in the stillness of the stable. "I can hear my own heart." He took a step closer, his gaze searching hers in the dim light. "I said enough," he answered, his voice a low rumble. "I said enough to keep you here." It was not a boast, but a statement of fact, a simple, profound truth. He reached out, not to embrace her, but to take her hand. His fingers were calloused and strong, but his touch was gentle for a man accustomed to the hard reality of iron and leather. He laced his fingers through hers, a silent, solid connection. He looked at her mouth, then back to her eyes, a silent question. She gave a slight, almost imperceptible nod. He leaned in, and his lips met hers. It was a kiss as quiet and as understated as the man himself. It was not a claiming, but a question asked and answered in the same breath. It tasted of the cold night air and the faintest trace of coffee, a gentle warmth that spread through her, chasing away the last of the day's chill. When he drew back, they stood for a long moment, their hands still entwined, their breath mingling in the cool air. The storm of rumor had been faced down, for now. A greater storm of violence was brewing in the night, but here, in the quiet of the stable, surrounded by the simple, honest life of the stable, a small, steady light had been kindled against the darkness. The night of the ferry crossing was a black, dripping thing. A relentless, heavy rain fell from a starless sky, turning the riverbank into a treacherous slope of slick, sucking mud. The Guadalupe was a roaring beast in the darkness, its voice a constant, angry growl. It was a perfect night for violence, a night to swallow secrets whole. Hidden in a thicket of willows 50 yards from the ferry landing, Eli Whitlock watched and waited. His small posse, a handful of townsmen who had answered his call, were positioned in the shadows, their knuckles white on the stocks of their rifles. He had given them simple, clear instructions no one was to fire until he did. He had a single lantern, its sides shielded with tin, casting a narrow, controlled beam that he could uncover in an instant. His signal to the men was the low, two-note call of a hunting owl. Further down the bank, crouched in the darkness, was Silas Pike and his 3 men. They were shadows among shadows, armed and patient. With them, holding a small, shielded tinderbox, was George Turner. His hands trembled so violently he could barely keep the flame from extinguishing. Rain plastered his fine hair to his forehead, and his face was a pale, ghastly mask of terror. He was to light a torch at Pike's signal, the signal for the ambush of the gold wagon. Watching from a rise above them, concealed by a cluster of rain-soaked cedars, was Martha Caldwell. She had followed Agnes, who had slipped out of town saying she needed to give George his supper. Martha's suspicion, a cold, hard knot in her stomach, had led her here. She saw the men with rifles, saw George's trembling hands on the tinderbox, and the terrible, ugly truth fell into place like the tumblers of a lock. The witch hunt, the fire, the fear she had so carefully cultivated, it had not been for justice. It had been a diversion, a brilliant, evil piece of theater, and she had been its chief architect, its most willing fool. Agnes was beside her, her hand over her mouth, her eyes wide with the same horrifying realization. The plan had been Eli's, but the crucial element had come from Isabella. When he had laid out the ambush, she had spoken up, her voice quiet but firm in the lamplit sheriff's office. "They will be watching the road," she had said. "They expect the wagon. You need a different distraction, something on the water." She proposed the unthinkable. She would be the decoy. "I will take a small raft, pole it out into the current just above the landing. I will carry a shielded lantern. They will think it is a scout for the wagon, or someone trying to cross. It will draw their eyes to the water. I know the river's currents, even in the dark. I know how it pulls and where the snags are. I understand the flow better than men who only see its surface." Eli had refused at first, the thought of putting her in such danger a cold spike in his gut. But he saw the resolve in her eyes, the same resolve that had faced down a mob, and he knew she was right. It was the one variable the outlaws would not expect. So now, she was out there, a lone figure on a small, crude raft, poling against the current, a single point of light in the vast, roaring darkness. The rain soaked her cloak, but her movements were steady. Her knowledge of the river a tangible thing, an extension of her own body. Pike saw the light. He cursed under his breath. "What in blazes is that?" He gestured to one of his men. "Go see, quietly." It was the moment Eli was waiting for. As Pike's man broke cover and crept toward the riverbank, Eli raised his hand and gave the low, mournful call of an owl. The night exploded. Eli uncovered his lantern, its beam slicing through the rain to illuminate the stunned face of Pike's man. In the same instant, Eli's rifle cracked, a single, sharp report that sent the man stumbling backward into the mud. From the willows, the other rifles opened up. Gun flashes lit the scene in brief. Hellish tableaus, the shocked face of Silas Pike, the wild eyes of his men as they dove for cover, the dark, churning water of the river. Isabella extinguished her lantern and poled the raft hard toward the far bank, out of the line of fire, her heart hammering. Silas Pike was a cornered wolf. He returned fire, his shots wild in the dark. A bullet tore through the sleeve of Hank's coat, and he grunted in pain, a hot line of fire searing his arm. "Toby!" Now Eli yelled. The young male boy, who had been crouched beside Hank, scrambled to his feet and ran, his long legs pumping through the mud, slipping and sliding as he sprinted toward the distant lights of the town and the church bell. The firefight was short, brutal, and confusing. Gunpowder smoke mingled with the rain, thick and acrid. One of Pike's men went down with a cry. The other broke and ran, disappearing into the darkness. Pike was alone, trapped between the river and the rifles. On the rise, the sound of the gunshots had sent Agnes into a blind panic. She stumbled backward, her feet slipping on the wet pine needles. Martha grabbed for her, but it was too late. Agnes slid down the muddy embankment, clawing for purchase. A terrified scream torn from her throat as she tumbled toward the churning, debris-filled river. She came to a stop just short of the water. Her leg twisted beneath her at an unnatural angle, a sharp cry of pain mixing with her sobs. Eli moved forward, his rifle steady. "It is over. Pike, drop it!" Pike, seeing his situation was hopeless, threw his pistol into the mud with a curse. At that moment, the first distant, frantic clang of the church bell reached them, a sound of conscience and alarm cutting through the storm. It was soon answered by another sound, the shouts of men. The glow of dozens of lanterns bobbing through the rain as the people of San Jacinto, for the first time, ran not as a mob, but as a posse, coming to the aid of their sheriff. Eli kicked Pike's gun away and bound his hands. He then turned to George Turner, who was huddled on the ground, sobbing, the unlit torch still clutched in his hand. "George," Eli's voice was cold and hard. "The fire, the tax box, talk." It all came out in a torrent of broken, desperate words. The gambling debts to Pike, the pressure. Pike had forced him to steal the tax box during the storm, had made him burn the granary. He said no one would look at me if they had a witch to blame. George wept, his words choked with shame. The rumor, it was just a screen, a way to keep the town busy, to keep you looking the wrong way while he planned this. Down by the water's edge, the scene was one of pure chaos. Martha had scrambled down the bank to Agnes's side, but she was helpless. Agnes's leg was clearly broken, and any movement sent fresh waves of agony through her. The river, still rising, was now licking at the ground just inches from where she lay. Then, a figure appeared, poling a small raft out of the darkness. It was Isabella. She had seen Agnes fall. She guided the raft to the bank and leaped off, a coil of rope in her hand. "Do not move her," Isabella commanded, her voice calm and authoritative in the midst of the panic. She knelt beside the weeping Agnes, ignoring Martha's stunned, guilt-ridden stare. She quickly assessed the situation, her eyes missing nothing. "We have to secure her before the bank gives way," with the same deft, sure hands that had saved the cattle. She looped the rope around Agnes's waist, running it around the base of a solid tree. She tied it off with a swift, complex knot that held fast. She had saved the life of the woman who had led the chorus of her condemnation. Martha Caldwell knelt in the mud, the cold rain plastering her hair to her face, and watched. She watched the woman she had called a blight, a shadow, a witch, work with quiet, life-saving competence. She saw not an enchantress, but a woman of profound strength and a capacity for grace that Martha could not begin to comprehend. The foundation of her righteous certainty crumbled, washed away by the muddy, truth-telling water of the Guadalupe. All that was left was the bitter taste of her own poison and a devastating, soul-searing shame. The church bell continued to ring out over the water, each toll a hammer blow against the lies that had nearly torn the town apart, each peal a promise that the truth, no matter how deeply buried in the mud, would eventually be brought into the light. The dawn that broke over San Jacinto was a quiet, wounded thing. The rain had finally stopped, and the rising sun painted the bruised clouds in pale shades of rose and gray. The Guadalupe, though still high and brown, had lost its murderous roar, its voice subdued to a deep, steady murmur. The night's violence felt like a fever that had broken, leaving the town exhausted, ashamed, and irrevocably changed. In the muddy street in front of the sheriff's office, The legal consequences of the fever were being dispensed. Silas Pike, his face a mask of sullen fury, was chained in the back of a prison wagon, destined for the county seat and the gallows that surely awaited him. Eli Whitlock stood by the wagon, his rifle held loosely in one hand, his face as impassive as ever, though the lines of fatigue around his eyes were etched deeper than usual. Mayor Caldwell approached, his steps hesitant. He was a man diminished, the bluster and self-importance stripped from him, leaving behind a tired, anxious man who had seen the ugly truth of his town's soul. He stopped before Eli, twisting the brim of his hat in his hands. "Sheriff," he began, his voice raspy. "George Turner, his wife, Agnes, is with Dr. Finch. The leg is broken badly. George is, well, he is in your custody." "He will stand trial," Eli said, his voice flat, "for theft and for his part in the fire." "Yes, of course," the mayor said quickly. "But his confession, his testimony against Pike, surely that counts for something. He was a weak man, sheriff, manipulated by a stronger one. And by the talk we all allowed. The circuit judge will take his confession into account," Eli conceded. "I will write in my report that he cooperated fully. Leniency is a possibility." A small measure of relief washed over the mayor's face. He cleared his throat, gathering himself for the harder task. That morning, from the same church steps where Eli had made his stand, the mayor had made his own speech. He had stood before the town and offered a formal, unequivocal apology on behalf of the town's leadership. He had spoken of the poison of rumor, of the duty of the law to protect the innocent from the mob, and of the town's collective failure. He had publicly praised Isabella Morales for her courage and grace. It was a necessary, humbling act, and the silence in which the town had received it was one of deep, sober reflection. "Sheriff," he said now, looking Eli in the eye for the first time, "my apology this morning was official. This one is personal. I let my wife's prejudices cloud my judgment. I failed in my duty to you and to the law you represent. I am sorry." Eli gave a slight, almost imperceptible nod. "The law was served, Mr. Mayor. That is what matters." He turned as the driver of the prison wagon cracked his whip. The wagon lurched forward, its wheels sinking into the mud, and began its slow journey out of town, taking the last of the night's violence with it. The change in San Jacinto was not a sudden conversion, but a slow, quiet turning, like a sunflower seeking the light. It was visible in small, meaningful acts. The baker's wife, who had once refused Isabella flour, was now a different woman. When a poor farmer's wife came in, her purse holding only a few pennies, the baker's wife pushed a warm loaf of bread into her hands. "Pay me when the crop comes in," she said, her voice gruff to hide her own surprise. "No one in this town goes hungry. Not anymore." On Sunday, Father Donovan stood before his congregation, his gaze steady and clear. He did not speak of witches or demons. He spoke of the simple, difficult commandment to love one's neighbor. His sermon was a quiet, powerful indictment of their behavior. "Do not judge with envious eyes," he told them, his voice resonating in the hushed church. "For envy sees a rival in a neighbor, a threat in a stranger, and a curse in a blessing. It is the ugliest of sins, for it poisons the well from which we all must drink." And outside the saloon, where the old notice against spreading rumors had been torn down in the night, a new one was posted, nailed up by Eli himself. The lettering was stark, black, and permanent. It read simply, "Slander is a crime." Isabella spent the morning after the shootout in Dr. Finch's small surgery, a place that smelled of carbolic acid and clean linen. Hank sat on a stool, his face pale, while she cleaned and stitched the long, shallow gash on his arm. Her hands were steady, her movements precise, the needle flashing in the morning light. Dr. Finch, his own hands busy setting Agnes Turner's leg in the next room, had been grateful for her help. As she tied the final knot and began to wrap the wound with clean bandages, the door to the surgery opened. Martha Caldwell stood there, flanked by Ruth and Dorothy. They were not the proud, judgmental matriarchs of a few days ago. They were three pale, hesitant women, their eyes red-rimmed, their fine dresses spattered with the mud of the riverbank. They stood in silence, watching Isabella work. They saw her gentleness, the quiet competence with which she tended to the ferryman's wound. They saw Hank, a man not given to sentiment, look at her with an expression of profound, gruff gratitude. This was the woman they had hounded, the woman they had tried to drive from her home. When Isabella was finished, she looked up and met Martha's gaze. There was no triumph in her eyes, no accusation. There was only a quiet, waiting stillness. Martha took a hesitant step into the room. Her hands trembled as she unfastened a small silver brooch from the collar of her dress. It was an old, intricate piece, a family heirloom, its surface worn smooth by the hands of generations of women. She stepped forward and, without a word, held it out to Isabella. Her hand was shaking. Her lips moved, but no sound came out. The words of apology would not form. They were too small, too inadequate for the great wrong she had done. The brooch was all she had to offer, a silent, desperate plea for forgiveness. Isabella looked at the piece of silver lying in Martha's palm. She saw it not as a jewel, but as a heavy, painful burden that the woman was trying to lay down. She reached out and gently closed Martha's fingers over the brooch. "Keep it for your daughters," Isabella said, her voice soft. "Teach them to be kinder than their mothers were." She then picked up her basket and walked out of the surgery, leaving the three women standing in the antiseptic silence, enveloped by a shame that was, in its own way, the beginning of their redemption. Later that evening, as the last light of the day bled from the sky, Eli found her down by the river. The Guadalupe was calm now, its surface a placid, muddy mirror reflecting the peaceful sky. The fury was gone, leaving only a quiet, steady current. They walked together along the bank, the silence between them comfortable, a shared language. "I am not good with words," Eli said finally, breaking the quiet. He was looking at the river, but she knew he was talking about everything that had happened, everything he felt. She stopped and turned to him, a faint smile on her lips. "I can hear the ones you do not say." He met her gaze, and in his eyes she saw the vast, quiet landscape of his soul, a place where feelings ran deeper than any river. He reached into his coat pocket and pulled out something small. He pressed it into her hand. It was a ring, but not one of gold or silver. It had been fashioned from a single, long strip of dark leather, braided into a simple, intricate knot that was both beautiful and unbreakable. It was something he had made himself, with his own strong, patient hands. It felt warm and solid in her palm. "No loud promises," he said, his voice a low, rough murmur. "Just a promise to stay." She slipped the ring onto her finger. It fit perfectly. It was not a promise of forever, not a pledge of undying passion. It was a promise of presence, of steadfastness. In the harsh, uncertain world of the Texas frontier, it was the most profound and precious promise a man could make. They stood by the quiet river, their hands joined, and watched the first stars begin to appear in the darkening sky. The rescheduled harvest dedication took place a week later, under a clear, benevolent sky that seemed scrubbed clean by the recent storms. It was the same square, with the same long tables, but the town itself was different. The brittle tension was gone, replaced by a quiet, more thoughtful mood. People spoke in lower voices, their laughter was softer, and their eyes, when they met, held a new measure of consideration. At the heart of the gathering, standing behind a table piled high with golden brown loaves of bread, was Isabella Morales. She was not on the edge of the festivities, an object of suspicion, but at its very center, one by one, The townspeople approached her, the same men and women who had shunned her, who had called for her exile. They took the bread she offered, their hands brushing hers, and they met her gaze. "Thank you. Isabella," they said, the simple use of her first name a quiet apology, an acknowledgement of her place among them. She answered each with a small, genuine smile, her forgiveness offered as freely as the bread she had baked. Leaning against a post on the boardwalk, Sheriff Eli Whitlock watched over the scene. His presence was a familiar comfort now, the silver star on his chest a symbol not of cold authority, but of the steady, unwavering principle that had pulled them all back from the brink. He was no less quiet, but his silence was no longer seen as detachment. It was understood as strength. Young Toby ran up to him, grinning, and offered him a slice of apple pie, an offering Eli accepted with a rare, small smile of his own. The boy, who had run for help through the mud and rain, now saw the sheriff not as a fearsome legend, but as the man who had trusted him to do the right thing. Across the square, a different kind of transformation was taking place. Martha Caldwell, her face stripped of its harsh piety and softened by a newfound humility, was directing a group of women, including Ruth and Dorothy. They were not gathering to pass judgment, but to pack wooden crates with the surplus food from the harvest tables. It was Martha's idea, a new town charity, a winter pantry for any family that might fall on hard times. Her formidable organizational skills, once used to marshal opinion and enforce social dogma, were now being used to build a safety net of compassion. As she worked, her gaze met Isabella's across the bustling square. Martha gave a slow, respectful nod, a gesture of peace that was returned in kind. The war between them was over, leaving not a victor and a vanquished, but two strong women who had found a different way to lead. Later, as the afternoon sun cast long shadows across the town, a letter arrived for Isabella. Toby delivered it with a sense of importance, a crisp envelope bearing the postmark of a city far to the east. She took it inside her small, quiet house and opened it. It was from a distant cousin who had heard, through the winding channels of gossip that could sometimes carry good news as well as bad, of her skill as a baker. He was opening a new, modern bakery in the city, a place of glass windows and marble counters, and he was offering her a partnership. It was a chance for a new life, a life of prosperity and anonymity, far from the red dust and painful memories of San Jacinto. She sat for a long time, the letter in her lap, the leather ring on her finger a warm, solid presence. She thought of the city, of its noise and its crowds, of the chance to build something new, to be known only for the work of her hands. She weighed it against San Jacinto, against the quiet streets that had been the backdrop for both her deepest sorrow and her most profound salvation. She thought of the faces in the square that day, faces that had once been twisted with suspicion and were now open with a hard-won respect. And she thought of the quiet man who had stood between her and the mob, the man whose silence was more eloquent than any speech. That evening, she found him by the river. The Guadalupe flowed peacefully, its surface reflecting the deep purple and gold of the sunset. He was watching the water, as he often did, as if reading a long, familiar story in its currents. He turned as she approached, his eyes asking the question his lips did not form. She stood beside him, and, for a while, they watched the river together in a comfortable silence. "I received a letter today," she said finally, her voice soft in the evening air. "An offer to leave this place, to open a bakery in the city." He did not react, his expression unchanged. He did not ask what she would do. He did not offer advice. He simply waited, giving her the space and the respect to own her own decision. He trusted her, just as he had trusted her on the river in the dark. She looked at the leather ring on her finger, twisting it gently. "The city has a great many words," she said, more to herself than to him. "A great deal of noise. I think I prefer it here." She looked up at him, her gaze clear and certain. Love here does not need many words. A slow smile touched Eli's lips, reaching his eyes and filling them with a light that outshone the fading sun. He looked away from her, out at the river, at the endless, steady flow of the water that had been both their tormentor and their crucible. "The water still flows," he said, his voice a low, contented rumble. "But the right people stay." Thank you for listening to our story. We would love for you to comment where you are listening from so we can all connect and share our thoughts. And please subscribe to my channel Wild West Night, like the video, and support us further by pressing the hype button so this story can be heard by more people.